John F. Kennedy was assassinated 40 years ago today. Here's a discussion on the book, President Kennedy Has Been Shot. CBS's Bob Schieffer and other journalists who covered the event share their thoughts on how well the media reported and responded to Kennedy's assassination. This is 2 hours.
Well, thank you very much. And let me just quickly introduce the panel here. Next to me is Sid Davis. In those days, Sid was with Westinghouse Broadcasting. Westinghouse had one of the great Washington bureaus back in the days when radio maintained large bureaus here, and they had one of the best. Sid later was the bureau chief for NBC and a vice president for NBC. My old colleague Ike Pappas back here, longtime CBS News correspondent, and as you'll find out, Ike had a chance to see the extraordinary thing that happened when they brought Oswald out to transfer him to the county jail. Ike was at the city jail. I was waiting over at the county jail, and of course, Oswald never got there. And then my old friend Bob Clark, longtime correspondent for ABC. Bob Clark saw this. He is the last surviving member of the press pool that day when they were all in Dallas. And Bob also saw the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. Let me just start here with you, Bob. You were just 3 cars behind the car carrying President Kennedy when you heard the gunshots. What went through your head, and tell us what you heard and saw.
Okay. To get it straight factually, we were the 5th car in
5th car.
motorcade. But
Well, that's close enough for TV.
That becomes significant. The principal member, the press star in that pool car, of course, was Merriman Smith. But there were 4 reporters, and Mac Kilduff, who sadly died this last year as the acting White House press secretary. We were just making the turn into this sharp intersection in front of the Texas School Book Depository when the first shot rang out, then, which we thought was, I thought was, sounded more like a loud backfire, but then 2 more quickly in a total of 6 or 7 or 8 seconds. And the shots were extremely loud, very clear, and what is more significant, they were fired from, we all felt from our immediate area, from up above us, and we were almost underneath the 6th floor window where Oswald was firing. So that, you want me to go a little farther?
Sure.
What happened? But when there were, the 3 shots were fired, Merriman Smith, who I knew was a gun fancier, said those were shots, and we accepted the fact that they were. And our car came to a halt for a few seconds, just long enough for some strange things to happen. A police man on a motorcycle pulled up in front of us, jumped off his motorcycle, and pulled out his revolver and went roaring up onto the grassy knoll. You may have wondered, some of you, that I find people just accept this. There was just behind us in the motorcade a pool car of photographers, but there are no pictures of Kennedy. The press goes to great expense to follow the president wherever he goes, so there will always be pictures. Why aren't there of the assassination? Because
let me just interrupt. Did the pool car going out to the hospital with the president after it speeded up?
Yeah, I was going to say,
okay.
The press pool car did, the writing press, but the photographers followed their basic instincts as photographers, jumped out and followed the action instead of carrying out their primary duty of following the president. And so they were just left behind when the motorcade suddenly took off very rapidly, as fast as it could accelerate again. The photographers were all left behind, and it was only our pool car that went on to the hospital.
On to the hospital.
And we did, just to substantiate your story, we became the 3rd car, I guess, because we pulled out and passed the vice president's car, which is
Now, Ike, you work for what, WNEW, which is what, a New York radio station?
A New York radio station, very rich and powerful station, could afford to send people like me around.
And where were you when the shots rang out?
Beg pardon?
Where were you when the shots rang out?
Well, I was not in Dallas. I was in New York City. I had a day off. I worked Tuesday, I worked Sunday to Thursday in those days. I had Friday and Saturday off. And my plan was to have a wonderful day off walking around Greenwich Village. And I had to go to the dentist first, Painless Pete Koutros, who is still my dentist. And so I told him I'd give him a plug every time I could.
So what happened? You got a call?
Well, I'm getting to it. And I'm trying like hell not to call you Dan tonight. So it's anyway, I went through with my plan. I went to the dentist, and he got done real fast, and it was getting toward lunchtime, and I said, well, I'm going down to Greenwich Village, and I hopped on a train, I hopped on a subway, came out on West 4th Street, and as soon as I hit the street, this lady came running up to me, and she was hysterical. She was screaming, the president had been shot, the president's dead, the president's shot, and she was crying, and her face was wetted down with her tears, and I remember her hair falling over in front of her face because she was crying so much. And I'm a bit of a cynic in those days. I said to myself, well, tonight when the tourists come down, lady, you can tell them that story. I don't believe it. But then I noticed something that was happening in New York City, and you don't see it quite often, and that is people were starting to talk to each other. They were stopping and talking, and there was an electricity in the air. And I said, oh, could it be? And I went running over to the phone booth and across the way, across 6th Avenue, and I put a nickel in the slot. It was a nickel in those days. And I called my office, and as soon as the phone was answered, NEW, I could hear, and the guy didn't have to tell me, the editor did not have to tell me, because I could hear bing, 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 the bulletins going, and the people shouting, the teletypes going, telephones ringing, and I said, what's this about Kennedy? And all he said, and this is to be historically correct, he said, get your ass up here. And I jumped into a cab, and my heart sank. My first thought was, they got him. Who was they? The segregationists. There was a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation at that time that he should not go to Dallas because there was threats against his life, perhaps, and everybody was saying that because of his stand against civil rights. I mean for civil rights rather, and against the segregationists in the South. And there were warnings that he shouldn't go, and my heart sank, and I grabbed a cab, and these are details that I think are not historically necessary, but are interesting. I jumped into the cab, and I said, get me up to 46th Street and 5th Avenue immediately, and I kept throwing money at him. And he said, what's going on? I said, well, turn on the radio. I need to hear the radio. Because at that point, I didn't know whether the president was alive or dead, or what had happened to him. But in any event, he said to me, we turned on the radio, and the radio announcer said that President Kennedy had been shot, and I don't think that we knew at that point whether he was dead or not. And he turns around to me and he said, oh, his cab driver in New York City, he says, you mean I got that guy Johnson to worry about now? All he had on his mind was who the next president was going to be that was going to give him a bad time. So I just said, get me up there, will you? And I was really distressed. And as soon as I walked into the station, I was handed $500 and a tape recorder and all the wire copy that they could pull, and they stuffed my pockets with it, and about $500. And I went running out into the street, and my instructions were, get to Dallas any way you can. And now there's a problem too, because New York City at the time was not exactly in panic, but there was a lot of tension, and there was a lot of concern because we didn't know what was going to follow. There was a lot of concern about whether we're going to be struck by the Soviet Union. Was this a precursor to some attack on our country to kill the president and then attack us? People wanted to get home. They flooded into the streets. They were grabbing anything they could, cabs, and pouring out of the garages. And Manhattan was in an early form of gridlock. It was packed solid on the streets. And my job was to get across the bridge and get to the airport, but we had to stop and go, and we tried to get through the side streets of Manhattan, and everything was jammed. We finally made it across the bridge, and the cab driver, because here's a case where I kept throwing dollar bills and $50 bills or whatever I had in my pocket at him, and he loved it because we kept going. And he said, "You want to get to where are we going? Idlewild, right?" Idlewild, later named Kennedy Airport, and it was quite a distance away in those days. I mean, now you can get there in minutes. But in any event, where the challenge was to get to the airport and find an airplane going to Dallas, and he said, "I'll get you there." And he took the side streets, and I think we cut across 15 lawns that day. We were going through hanging laundry. I think we must have killed at least 2 or 3 dogs and maybe a cat getting there. But I kept saying, "Keep going." We were going through the side streets parallel to the Van Wyck Expressway, and we were plugging them and saying, keep going, damn it." And finally, we went around the traffic, and we got back on the highway. We got to the airport, and I said, "Take me to Delta Airlines." I took a shot, any airline. I want to find out what's going on out here. And I went running in, and I told the cab driver, "You stay right here. I don't want to lose you." And I gave him another $20, and he stayed. And I went running in, and I'm screaming at the desk clerk, "Are you going to Texas? Are you going to Dallas?" And he said, "Nobody's going anywhere. The airport's closed. All the airports in the country are closing." Now what? But he says, there's a plane that American Airlines is organizing. It's a special flight that I think the Secret Service has organized, and you better get over to American. Great. So my cab driver took me to American. I had him stay. I went in and I verified this, that there was a plane being prepared. It was a plane that was supposed to go to California, I believe, but was canceled by the Secret Service and the FBI. They just told the passengers, "You're not going anywhere. This plane is commandeered virtually." And any reporter that could get there, and the Secret Service agents from New York and FBI, and any reporter that could get there, if he had a press pass, could get on. And so I'm going to end it here. I'll get you down to Dallas, and then I'll pick it up after that because we got other people to go.
Okay. So Ike's
let me
getting on the
just-
airplane.
Let me just finish it up.
All right.
This is the tag. The last thing I saw before we took off, and now I felt better about everything. At least I was on the airplane. I didn't feel very good about the story, but the last thing I saw was the public relations director of American Airlines at the time running up the steps before they pulled the steps away, and we took off with about 5 bottles of booze in his hands and some sandwiches, and that's what we had on the way down. So
Okay.
they were trying to take care of us anyway. So we took off at Dallas, and that's where my coverage started.
All right, so you're flying to Dallas. Sid, where were you, and what were some of the problems that you had here in the
Well, I was on press bus number 1 with, among others, Bob Donovan, then of the Los Angeles Times, and Bob Pierpoint of CBS News. I had been in Fort Worth the night before with the President and Mrs. Kennedy. I should point out that this was her first political trip out almost since the election. She had had a tragedy that summer. They lost Patrick Bouvier, a little child about 2 or 3 days old. This was the first time she really was exposed to this political atmosphere, which she didn't enjoy particularly. And I think we all noticed, and I think Bob Clark mentioned this to me some time ago, that it was the first time we ever saw Kennedy show affection to Mrs. Kennedy in public. He was really a bashful person from all you've heard about him. And he took her by the hand and took her over to the crowd at the fence in Fort Worth so that she could meet some of the well-wishers that morning. And we never saw her happier than she was that morning leaving Fort Worth in that, I call it a raspberry 2-piece suit. I wrote an article for American Heritage, and the editors changed that to pink. I don't think Mrs. Kennedy would have called it pink. In any case, we took off for Dallas. I was on press bus number 1 going into town. The crowds were very warm, enthusiastic. There were some signs that were negative, but not very many, not what we expected, because there had been some problems in Dallas with Adlai Stevenson before that, where he was heckled and hit in the head with a placard. But we saw none of that in Dallas, and we drove downtown around Dealey Plaza, and that's where we heard the shots. There were 3 distinct shots. I didn't think the first one was a shot, but Bob Pierpoint said without any doubt those were gunshots. And then we noticed up ahead that the presidential limousine had disappeared from the motorcade. It just had taken off. And we did see people running. We saw people, parents shielding their children on this grassy knoll. And we asked the bus driver to catch the limousine. And there's no way that city bus was going to catch the presidential limousine. It had taken off at 70 miles an hour. So we went to the trademark where the president was supposed to speak, and there were, I think, a couple of thousand people in there. We ran through the hall like a herd of elephants looking for the press room. I called my office and said that shots had been fired in the motorcade. We don't know what happened to the president. My bureau chief, Jim Snyder, said, it looks like the president's in a place called Parkland Hospital. Get over there. So I filed a piece on what I'd seen up to that point. And then I ran outside with my Olivetti typewriter, and I was waving it in the air, and a black gentleman in a Cadillac, white Cadillac, saw me, stopped the car, rolled the window down, said, "Are you a reporter?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I'll get you to Parkland Hospital." And we took off like a rocket and went to Parkland. And I filed some stories from there. We heard the president was still alive, but very gravely wounded. I saw a group of reporters down a hallway, and there were two Catholic priests. One of them's name is Father Oscar Huber, 67 years old, as I recall. And I heard him say, over the crowd of reporters, "He's dead all right. I've given him the last rites." These two priests had gone through the hospital. I talked to several groups of reporters because they'd already been downstairs in the lower level when I saw them. And then I went to the phone, and I told Washington not to put this on the air. I said, "A priest says he's dead, and I don't think you ought to put it on the air. I've not confirmed it, and we're waiting for a briefing." And it was agreed that we would not go on the air with that, so we didn't put that on the air. When the announcement was finally made in the little nurses' training room, it was made by Malcolm Kilduff, Associate Press Secretary to the President. Pierre Salinger was on his way to Asia with a group of government officials. Kilduff was in tears. He could barely speak the words. He told me later, just about a year ago, that he opened his mouth and nothing came out. He had been downstairs with the Kennedys, with Mrs. Kennedy and the staff, and he was the one that had to go to President Johnson and tell him he had to talk to the press and make the announcement. And this is Kilduff's story. He went to Lyndon Johnson and looked at him, and he said, "Mr. President." And he said Johnson was startled because he was the first person ever to call Johnson Mr. President. And I have to tell the press that the President Kennedy's dead. And Johnson said, "Wait a few minutes until I leave. We don't know whether this is an international conspiracy or not." So Kilduff waited a few minutes, then went upstairs to the press room, and in tears, he said, "John F. Kennedy died at 1 p.m. today, Central Standard Time in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound to the brain." And bedlam broke out in that press room. I ran for a phone. Everybody ran for the phones. And while I was filing, a White House Transportation Office official, Jiggs Fawver, Edwin Fawver, grabbed me by the shoulder while I was on the air live and said, "Come with me, we need a pool immediately." And I said, "I was the pool last night in Fort Worth. It's not my turn. I'm filing, I've got to do this story." He said, "No, you must come with me." So he dragged me from the phone, and we picked up Chuck Roberts of Newsweek and Merriman Smith of the United Press International, the dean of the White House Correspondents. He was a great reporter, truly. They put us in an unmarked police car, and they didn't tell us where we were going, and we raced to Love Field, which is the airport where we came in, where Air Force One was waiting. Johnson was already there, which we didn't know. On the way to the airport, we heard on the police radio that a suspect had been apprehended in the theater. I asked the police officer driving the car if he would phone my office, get his office to phone my office to tell him where I was. They didn't know where I disappeared to. And he said, "No, we're maintaining radio silence. We don't know whether there are other killers." So we got to the airport just as the casket was being put aboard Air Force One. And Johnson was already aboard the airplane. Now, I can go on and tell you what happened.
I was going to say, because you were actually the pool reporter who was inside Air Force One when Johnson took the oath. Why don't we hold that for just a second, and then we'll come back, because I think that's a very, the way as many of you because I've told this story about 1,000 times now, the way I got to Dallas that day, I was the night police reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and I was very upset because I hadn't been assigned to cover Kennedy when he came to Fort Worth that night. But the next day when he was shot, I was asleep because I didn't get off till 3 o'clock in the morning, and I normally slept well past noon. And my brother, who was in high school, came in and woke me up and said, "You better get to work. The president's been shot." And I was just completely discombobulated to find out this news. To make a long story short, by the time I got to the city room, it had come over the radio that the president was dead, and I was just trying to help answer the phones. A woman, I picked up one phone and she says, "Is there anybody there who can give me a ride to Dallas?" And I said, "Lady, this is not the taxi service, and besides, the president's been shot." And she said, "Yes, I heard it on the radio. I think my son is the one that they've arrested." And it was Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. And so I, wearing my snap brim hat, because when we worked on the police beat in those days, we never told people who we were. If they asked, we didn't lie about it. But if they wanted to assume that we were detectives, that's what we let them assume. The joke was that our view of the First Amendment was that everyone had a right to talk to the Star-Telegram even when they didn't know they were talking to the Star-Telegram. And that was sort of the rules of the road. So anyway, since I had a little Triumph sports car, I thought, well, I can't take this woman to Dallas in this open two-seater sports car, so I went to the auto editor. And in those days, the local car dealers would give the auto editor a car and free gas to drive for a week, and then he would write a little road report about it in the Sunday paper. The reviews were generally good, as you might imagine. So I said, "Bill, what kind of car you got?" And he said, "A Cadillac." His name was Bill Foster. And so we went out in that Cadillac, and Bill and I picked up Mrs. Oswald. She was standing out on her front curb, and drove her over to Dallas. So that's how I got there. And I want to pick up on something that Sid said and that also Ike said. One of the things that's kind of forgotten about that day is, yes, it was a shock. I mean, none of us had nothing like this had ever happened. We weren't used to these violent events. And in a good way to kind of understand how it was, we could all now remember exactly where we were and what we were doing that day. But ask yourself, can you remember immediately where you were when Ronald Reagan was shot? It's very difficult because there were so many violent events that happened between the Kennedy assassination and that shooting that by that time, sadly, we'd almost become used to it. But the other thing that I think, and you all mentioned it, that I think people don't remember is that in addition to this shock that nothing like this had ever happened, there was fear, almost like there was after 9/11, because we did not know what was going on. This was the height of the Cold War. The bombers of the Strategic Air Command were put on the highest alert. The borders of Mexico were closed off because people thought this might be the prelude to some sort of a war with the Soviet Union. So in addition to the shock, there was this fear that hung over everybody. We just didn't know, and it would be hours before we understood what was happening. Let me just go right back to Sid. You got on the airplane. What was it like in there as Johnson took the oath?
The plane had been sitting on the ground since we arrived at about 10 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock in the morning, so it was a hot, beautiful, sunny day, and it was sweltering on the airplane. The shades had been drawn, went back into the presidential suite, into a conference room. It's a gold laminated tapestry-walled room. I counted about 27 people in there, and I saw Lyndon Johnson and many of the Kennedy staff members, and I saw some people I didn't know. There were some Texas congressmen there. And Johnson asked whether the press had arrived, and he was told by Kilduff, who had already arrived at the airport, that we were here and we could proceed. Johnson at that point asked one of his aides to see if Mrs. Kennedy, he used the words, see if Mrs. Kennedy would like to stand with us. They sent word back to Mrs. Kennedy. She was seated with the casket in the rear of the plane. They removed 2 to 4 seats in the back of Air Force One to get this heavy bronze casket in there. And she said she'd like to join us, but she wanted some time to compose herself. And a few minutes later, she entered the room. There was silence for just a moment, and then the sobs broke out among some of the Kennedy staff people. They just couldn't hold it back. Johnson went over, took her by both hands, and moved her over to his left. Mrs. Johnson was on his right. He asked for a glass of ice water. He sipped the glass of ice water, and then he told Judge Hughes to proceed. She'd been brought from downtown Dallas, Judge Sarah Hughes.
Who was an old friend of Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, a friend of Johnson's and appointed by John Kennedy to the federal bench.
I think on Johnson's recommendation as part of his patronage, yes.
She administered the oath. I remember I was very concerned about being the pool reporter on a story of this size. I'd never covered anything like this and never thought I would. And so I was scared to death that I would get everything right. And so I used my watch. I clocked the oath at 28 seconds. Time was 2:38 p.m. Central Standard Time. Johnson took the oath. She said, "So help me God," at the end of it, and he repeated that. And then there was an effort by some people to come over and shake his hand, and he discouraged any congratulatory remarks. He kissed Mrs. Johnson, then he turned and kissed Mrs. Kennedy. I noticed that Mrs. Kennedy, when she moved, I could see the rest of her clothing. Her stockings were streaked with blood. Her skirt had streaks of blood. Her right hand and wrist had blood on it, and there was congealed because she had cradled his head, the president's head, in her lap in the limousine. And Johnson then, with great resolve, I thought, said, "Let's get airborne." The instructions were to take the oath in Dallas, and the instructions came from the president's brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Take the oath in Dallas and then get out of there. And that's what they did. And Swindle kept, Colonel Jim Swindle was the pilot of Air Force One, started to move down the runway. I got off the airplane. I was told that there were only 2 seats left on the plane. Merriman Smith, the wire service reporter, got one of them, and Smith, and I would have to flip a coin with Chuck Roberts for the second seat. And because I was a broadcaster and I could use the information and get back on the telephone and report the story, and Newsweek doesn't go to press with till Saturday night, I told Chuck Roberts of Newsweek, I'll get off. And so I got off the plane. I got off with Judge Hughes, and she was in tears. We walked down the stairway, and she told me that she had been appointed by Kennedy. As I was going down the stairs, Merriman Smith yells at me going down the stairs, "The oath was given at 2:37 p.m. Central Standard Time." And I nodded my head, and now I had to get the report to the other reporters.
All right, and you did that. Let's go back now to Dallas. Bob Clark, what happened then? You were with the...
Right, we're racing on to the hospital,
Yes.
not knowing where we're going. But the motorcade had taken off as fast as it could accelerate. The hospital was 4 miles away. There wasn't anybody in our car who had the faintest idea that the president had been shot or that anybody up ahead had been wounded. There is a tale of Smitty picking up the telephone and filing what became a celebrated bulletin. I'll leave that for the Q&A, anybody who's interested in the details of what happened between Smitty and Jack
Well,
Bell.
Bob, talk a little bit about the relationship in those days between the reporters and the officials like the Secret Service. Was it like it is now?
I'll do that when we get to the hospital.
All right.
I have a news peg for that. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll tell it about it right now.
Okay. When we did not have any idea that we were going to the hospital, the Warren Commission said we went at speeds up to 80 miles an hour. That's probably a slight exaggeration, but we may have hit 70. As we careened into the entrance to the hospital, we said, "My God, somebody's been hurt up there." We jumped out.
You didn't know at this point that it was the president who had
Had
been
no
shot.
idea. Jumped out of the car, raced up to where Kennedy was standing. Now, here's my news peg. Today, the Secret Service would keep the White House press back 2 blocks if they could get away with it. In those days, there were only 4 pool reporters who got onto the hospital. The Secret Service knew all of us, trusted us, and incredibly let us run up and stand right next to the car and stare down at Kennedy. So we did this, the 4 of us, independently. It was a frozen scene. That was a surprise to me. There were Secret Service standing around and a number of other people, but nobody was saying anything. Mrs. Kennedy sat with, obviously looking in a state of deep shock. She had, the president was lying with his head on the side of his head on the back seat, and she was cradling his head in her arms, so she almost had his head in her lap. There were no stretchers. It was 2 or 3 minutes before the stretchers came out. we were at the emergency entrance of the hospital until the stretchers came out for him. Connolly was stretched out. He and his wife had been on the jump seats in the back. He was stretched out on the floor. I have kicked myself later. I did not do a very good job of absorbing everything I could see, but the 4 reporters, none of them saw Kennedy wounds at that stage, and that has to be that Jackie was deliberately shielding his
Bob,
wounds.
how did you get your first report out? Because we didn't have cell phones and all
That
of that.
was surprisingly easy. Smitty and I made the decision at about the same time. I waited till the stretchers arrived and they were starting to put Kennedy aboard a stretcher, and I thought I better get inside the hospital where I thought I could get a telephone or I'll be cut out. And so Smitty and I at the same time started trotting toward the emergency entrance of the hospital. Smitty asked as he went in where there's a phone and got one nearby. I asked where there was another and was sent to an adjoining room and was on the phone in 30 seconds. And so telephones, surprisingly, were no problem those days, though we had only the one telephone in the car.
I, just by coincidence, spoke with the doctors that were at the hospital that received Kennedy and talked to them last night. And they said there was no question that the president was dead when he got there.
Well, that's been examined at great length. There were faint signs of life.
One of the doctors said there was faint signs, but they said he was dead.
Oh, yes, no
Now,
question.
let's just, we all know what happened next, and we've heard how you talked about the announcement. Let's fast forward, Ike, to Sunday. Oswald has been arrested. He's been brought in. He has shot J.D. Tippit, one of the policemen, in the process as they tried to arrest him. Then they finally get him in the theater and they bring him in. You were there. When did you get there? Did you get there in time to see him? You saw him that
I saw him
evening
later
when they
that
brought
night,
him in.
along with everybody else. But
Yeah.
I'll get you down to Dallas in a big hurry.
Yeah.
We got on the airplane, and we didn't know it at the time, but we flew first to Washington because they had other agents that they had to pick up. And that was the fastest turnaround I've ever had in an airplane. We must have been on the ground 6 minutes, and bam, we're up again. We're out of there. And now the next problem was to try to find out what was happening on the ground. We had 3 hours in the air, and we didn't know what was happening, and so we talked to the pilot and asked him, is there any way we can get some word from the ground? And he said, I'll patch the broadcasts as we pass over cities. We can take the broadcasts that we can pull out of the air and patch them into the cabins so all you guys will know what's going on. So we had almost a built-in briefing room. As we passed over one city, we found out that they were chasing someone from the school book depository. The next city, his name is Lee Harvey Oswald, and we're writing this down. He gave his vital statistics, how old and so forth, what he did. And then they captured him in the Texas theater. And all of these events were transpiring on the ground, and we had the story when we hit Love Field at around 8 o'clock that night. We went right over to the police headquarters, and I worked the story not routinely, because there were things that were breaking all over the place, and I had to file. And if you had a telephone, of course there were no cell phones in those days, but if you had a way to get a telephone, you were golden, because you were out with your story. You didn't do anybody any good if you had all the information in the world, no way to get it out. So my challenge was to try to find a telephone even at that point, and I did. I filed a couple of stories, so as long as I was in and I established my presence in Dallas, I was okay. But slowly in the evening, the pressure started to build on Police Chief Jesse Curry to bring down Oswald. And finally, the reporters that really knew him were really putting real pressure on him, the local guys and also the national people who were pouring in from all over the country. You have to understand what kind of a situation that was. People from Canada and from Mexico, and everybody was turning up in Dallas and running over there and trying to get access to the story. And the police didn't really know how to handle this. I think this was probably the first time they had anything of this magnitude. There were no rules, basically. Anybody who had a press card could get in, as long as you were wearing it. And they didn't try to control the media, the massive media that was there. And in any event, we had almost total access to that third floor where they were questioning Oswald, and a couple of times they brought him out. People yelled at him, and you see it in in the pictures. In
Well,
any event-
tell us about meeting that guy. You were looking for the phone that looked like he might be a cop. I think that's a fascinating story.
I'm getting, all right, I'll get to that. I was just about to go down there, by the way.
Okay.
But I thought might be interesting for you, journalists and so forth, and the general public to know what kind of pressure was being put on the police chief, Jesse Curry. Some of the reporters were saying, "Are you beating him up?" because he had a mouse over his eye. And the Curry said, "No, we're not beating him." "Well, bring him down then, let's see him." And he finally acquiesced. He caved in. He said, "Okay, we're going to bring him in at midnight in the lineup room, but no questions." And we said, "Oh, of course no questions. My God, absolutely no questions." So at midnight, Oswald comes in, shackled to three detectives surrounded by people and so forth. And of course, as soon as he hits the door, everybody yells at him. They were even yelling at him in the hallway. You know, "Did you shoot the president? How did you get hurt? What are they doing you? Why did you shoot the president?" And he just kind of dazed, they bring him up front. And we all gathered around and we all kept shouting at him. And that's when he said, "That's what I've been accused of." So somebody yelled, "Did you shoot the president?" I think I yelled at one point. We were all yelling the same thing. "Why did you shoot the president?" And he said, "No, that's what I've been accused of. That's what I've heard." But I forget the exact quote, but he denied it in effect. And then they said, "Okay, that's it. The rule's broken here. The ground rules are broken. And they started to take him out. But at least we had some sound with him. And then another reporter asked me, and he turned and he answered him again, saying that he wanted to see a lawyer. And anyway, after that event, that everybody's talking, the reporters are exchanging notes, and what did he say, what did he hear, what was the quote, and Henry Wade, the district attorney of Dallas County, is having a press conference outside of the room where Oswald was, and he's talking about the legal ramifications and what they're going to do with Oswald and so forth. And then I was going to go over and listen to him, and suddenly this little guy comes running up to me. And he had a dark gray pinstripe suit, and he had a snap brim fedora, not the one like yours, of course.
It was like it, yeah.
Maybe you went to the same hat shop there in Dallas, I don't know. But anyway, he kept running up to me, and I came running up to me, and I thought he was a vice cop. Now, if he was a vice cop, he would have a telephone. He'd have an office, so maybe I could promote him into letting me use his telephone. And I was, he came up to me and he said, "You're a reporter?" And I said, "Yes, I'm a reporter." He said, "Where are you from, New York?" I said, "Yes, I'm from New York." Then I asked him, "Are you a cop?" Because he looked like this guy that would hang around bars and trying to bust people that are trying to have fun. And anyway, he said, "No, I'm Jack Ruby. I run the Carousel Club down the block." And then he pulls out his card. And he says, "Hey, come on down to the club. Get some of you guys, some of you other reporters, come on down there. We got booze, we got women, we got music. Hey, we'll get you whatever you want." And I'm really taken aback by this, stunned by this, because here the Mexican borders, as you mentioned, are locked. We don't know if we're going to be attacked by the Soviet Union. The nation is in chaos. And here is this guy, pardon the phrase, pimping the press. He was out hustling business for his strip joint. He ran the Carousel Club, which was a strip joint. And I should have mentioned that earlier. You'd know what I'm talking about. In any event, I said to him, and I wanted to humor him, "Now, okay, I got your card," and I put it in my pocket here. I said, "Keep it right there. I'll get the guys. We'll all come over and spend a lot of money there." And then I said, "Now, can you get me because he appeared to me, he knew his way around this police station. And I thought he was a police buff, so he must know people here. And I said, "Can you get me a telephone?" He said, "Oh, you want a phone? Just a minute." So he goes over to Henry Wade, and he's listening for a while, but then when he gets his attention, he whispers something to him. He comes running back to me, and he says, "Come on." So he takes me into Henry Wade's office. This is Jack Ruby, mind you, who was later to be prosecuted by Henry Wade for shooting Lee Harvey Oswald. Now I have this guy taking me into his office. And I said, "Okay." And I called New York, and I fed my piece, and Henry Wade was still talking, and I did a couple of, on-scene things, ad-lib things. And in comes Henry Wade, and I did a telephone interview with him. You ask a question, and then you hand him the telephone, he answers it. And they're recording this in New York, and finally I had everything that I needed in New York so that they could chop that stuff up and use it for, 3 or 4 hours anyway. So the phone was hung up, and I disappeared, and I didn't know where Ruby went until about 2 o'clock in the morning. I had wrapped up my coverage at the police station. Oswald was tucked away in his cell. The reporters were filing, and so I went over to the local station, and I talked to the news director there, the small radio station. And I said, look, I need to file, I need a place to work, that's all, I need a telephone. So he said, oh, you just stay here all night, no problem. So I was there with the engineer, and the station was playing dirge music, funeral music. There was no commercials. It was just a terrible evening. And I started to work on my little typewriter, and there's a ring at the door. I didn't answer it. The engineer came down, and he opens the door, and in comes Jack Ruby with 2 bags of groceries. And I look up, and I said, there's that weird guy again. There's that strange guy. What's he doing here? And he said, hi, fellas, I saw the lights on. I thought you might need something to eat. You know, you guys are working hard. He said, take some sandwiches and some Cokes. I did not eat those sandwiches, I want you to know. I didn't trust this guy at all. I did have a Coke because it was sealed. But no kidding. I mean, somebody walks in and says, here, eat one of my sandwiches. You know, who knows what's in it. But anyway, I then dismissed him as a buff, as a guy who likes to hang around the excitement. Now he had the world press to cater to, not only the police but the fire people, and he left, and I finished my work, and I filed morning news stuff, and by that time it was sunrise, so I had to go back to coverage. I didn't sleep for 2 days there. Till I finally got some. And anyway, Saturday, I'll get you into Sunday. Saturday was more or less a routine day of filing stories. Nothing eventful happened to me, but I'm sure happened to the...
interrupt on
Yes.
Saturday and follow,
Sure.
because this relates to
Sure.
your experience with Oswald. I was sent in the next morning to cover Oswald at police headquarters. There were already stories in the morning papers about how rowdy the press had been the night before. So when I went in, I thought I will try to talk to the chief of police, Jesse Curry. I went by his office. He's sitting alone in his office. I went in and told him I was there for ABC, and I know you've had trouble with the press. What will the rules be today? He told me the same thing you'd been told the night before. Yeah. You may see Oswald, he may stop and say something to you, but there are no questions. That'll be the rule today, no questions. Well, 45 minutes later, by great coincidence, I was standing in a hallway, and I just picked out, no reason to suspect Oswald would be around, with a dead microphone. I was hooked up to a camera crew about 30 feet away. Suddenly, the door opposite me pops open, and here comes Oswald, flanked by a Secret Service and FBI, walked directly over to my microphone, said into my dead microphone, I want to contact Mr. Apt of New York City to serve as my attorney. Now there's a Q&A here. How many of you know today who John Apt was? How many? Do I see anybody? Nobody. Well, that doesn't surprise me, but it shocks me, because John Apt's identity, the reason you don't know who John Apt is because the FBI, the Justice Department, the Johnson administration didn't want you at that time to know who John Apt was. And I'm not going to spread any suspicions about Soviet involvement. I'm telling this story just to show how much the FBI and Justice Department controlled information at that point. John Apt was the chief counsel of the American Communist Party. He was the paid, we now know, he was the paid chief counsel, paid by the Soviet Union. If Oswald had gotten the attorney he wanted, Apt happened to be out of town in New York. If he'd gotten the attorney he wanted, his attorney would have been on the payroll of the Soviet Union. But the administration was so concerned, understandably, they thought we could be talking about World War III. Is it III we're up to now? World War III, if the Soviets were involved. So they said, not to this day, they have not released information on John Apt. I developed sort of an obsession about him. But John Apt took the Fifth Amendment before the House Un-American Activities Committee during the Alger Hiss case. From that time, you better believe the FBI started compiling a thick file on him. But up until today, they have never put out their file on John Abt. Okay. I tried when I worked for ABC in my closing years a few years ago and covered the Assassination Records Review Board. I tried to get any FBI records on John Abt. There were just a couple of meaningless releases, and but to this day, you would have trouble finding out any more about John Abt.
We're going to go to Q&A here, and just let's bring Sid in for one final.
I guess we haven't got Oswald shot yet.
Yeah, we got to get out.
But I did
We had that long airplane ride down to Dallas.
But I would like, because there are a lot of budding journalists in the room, I'm told, and some. I dug this out of a book that's written by Darwin Payne, who was a Dallas news reporter, detective from Dallas, testifying before the Warren Commission regarding media at the Dallas police station when Oswald was shot. This is what the detective said. He said he was disgusted with them, the media. If you ever slopped hogs and thrown down a pair of slop and saw them rush after it, you would understand what it was like up there, about the same situation. And then another comment was, as Police Chief Curry was explaining Oswald's transfer, one reporter brazenly scribbled notes on the pad he propped on the chief's back.
Let's go quickly to Ike and give us a little capsule. He was standing there. I had been sent over to the courthouse. They were going to transfer Oswald from the city jail to the county jail. I was at the courthouse waiting for him to get there. Ike was there when they brought him out of the city jail. What happened?
At CBS, they used to call that take 15 seconds out, which is what I had to have done to my pieces all the time. Thank you for reminding me to be succinct. Here we go. That morning, I got up early, of course, and went over to the jail to watch Oswald being transferred. We were told by Chief Curry that if you get here by 10:30, you won't miss anything. Now, I was very cynical. I was suspicious of that, too, because being a New York reporter, I mean, police would never do that in New York. They'd never tell you when they were moving him. So anyway, I trusted him, and I got there at 10:30, and he was still there. And I decided that I was going to try to one-up everybody else, and I wanted to get a scoop. And I went over to, I went up to the third floor where they were interrogating Oswald, and everybody else was down in the basement. They were getting set for that exit shot, and, you know, with the cops and that famous scene that we all know. However, I thought that if I could get an interview with Oswald as he came out, or just have him say anything, I would have a big score. And then I would get down to the basement somehow. Well, how would you get down, Pappas? I asked myself. Well, let's see, there's a stairwell there. It goes right to the basement. What I did was I practiced running down the stairwell twice to see whether I would be stopped by a cop or something, to see whether I had an exit. Because I always, if I was going to take a chance like that, if I were to take a chance like that, I would want a backup escape route or a backup plan. So I practiced, and this is an example of how loose the security was at the building that day. Everything was fine. Out comes Oswald, and I went forward with my microphone, and I asked him, do you have anything to say in your, I wanted to say defense, but a policeman, a detective threw me up against the wall, and they hustled him to the end of the corridor to where the elevators are, and they shoved him in the elevator, and down he goes. Now, my heart is leaping out of my chest because I said to myself, you will never work in this business again. How could you take such a chance? There goes the best story you'll ever cover in your life, and you're not there to report it, and you should be fired. Yeah, I should be fired, but I got to get down there. So I flew down the steps, and on the way down, it occurred to me, what if the door is locked? Now I'm really dead. And I reached for the door, and it opened. What relief. I went in, and now where to report this story? Everybody was already jammed in, and now where's Oswald? I said, is he gone? No, I saw him in the office of the security people. They were signing him out. They were giving him back his shoelaces and his wallet and whatever they take from you when you're arrested, because he was going to go to another jail. And anyway, I had caught up to the story, and I was pretty happy about that. But where do you report this? So I saw a little opening in the chase car, behind the wagon that they were going to take Oswald away in, and I squeezed in, and I moved in with my big New York elbows, and now I had a look at the door to the car, and I could report that. Oswald starts coming down, and I didn't know it at the time, but I was pushing right in front of Jack Ruby, rather, who was waiting to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald, and I blocked his view, I'm sure, for a while. Now, these are all split seconds. These things are happening in nanoseconds. Oswald's coming toward me, and I start to talk him up to my position, saying that he was led by Captain Will Fritz, who was interrogating, changed into a black sweater. And just when he gets over to where maybe Sid is, or just a few inches away, I went forward again. And I said, do you have anything to say in your defense? And just as I was saying defense, I heard footsteps. I saw a black streak in front of me, and then I said defense, and boom. I fell back. I felt the impact of the weapon on my body. And I saw the flash on his black sweater, of Oswald's black sweater. And Oswald moaned, and he went down. Now, there's a pause in my report because my brain, my computer in my head is trying to catch up with what's happened here. What have I just seen? Have I seen the assassin of the President of the United States himself assassinated? My God, he's been shot. Of course he's been shot. So the other thought that went through me, and it was just an impulse, it wasn't a thought, it was just an urge. I said, if you never say anything ever again into a microphone, you must say it now. This is history. Don't freeze. That was my main concern. Don't get so panicked that you can't report the story. But how do you put what I just saw into words? What I said was what I saw in front of me, which is what a reporter is supposed to do. Just tell me what's happening. And I said, there's a shot rang out. Now there's a fight. They were fighting for a gun, and I saw a gun being struggled with. The people caved in on Ruby. They dragged Oswald back through the double doors, and I kind of had a chance to look at that. And I saw Oswald's body and the two detectives that fell in sort of leaning over him. They recovered, and the two detectives then dragged him back. They didn't even take his handcuffs off, as far as I know. They were pulling him back by his hands through the double doors. And then Ruby disappeared, but we didn't even know it was Ruby then. I did not see his face. All I saw was a black flash in front of me. And out comes a detective after maybe 10 minutes of a lot of hubbub and a lot of notes and people, what did you see, blah, blah, blah. And out comes a detective, and we said, who was it? Who shot him? And he said, well, Jack Ruby shot that old boy. And I said, wait a minute, Jack Ruby. And I got his car. I got his car. This is incredible. I got Jack Ruby's card. Nobody knows about that. Boom. So I was staggered by that. I was stunned by that. But I felt. I mean, I was saddened by the entire event. But I felt that professionally, I felt very fortunate. Professionally, I felt very fortunate that I was that close to everything, and that I have actually met this person before, and I've never covered anything like it since.
Nor, I think, have any of us who were there. Okay, we got time for a couple of questions. Helen.
Why did Ruby shoot Oswald? Do you have any very...
Why did
he do it?
Why did Ruby shoot Oswald? Okay. My theory is, and it's only a theory, but it's, years of speculation and reading and so forth. Jack Ruby was a minuscule character in a mighty oligarchy, an oil oligarchy, an oil kingdom like Dallas. He was nothing. He was a guy who ran a strip club. He felt he had his power and fame through his place. He knew the cops that way. He would get the cops drinks. They would come in and whatever else. He knew the politicians because they came in. He may have known some of the football, but he was Jack Ruby. If you want to go somewhere, go to Jack's place. I thought afterwards, just looking and examining what he said he did it for, he wanted to avenge Jackie. Now, if he felt so terribly about Jackie, why would he have come up to me trying to hustle business that night? He would have been so upset and so fixed on Jackie and everything else. I never believed that, because I had an angle on this that nobody else did, and that is a personal encounter with Jack Ruby on the Friday before he shot Oswald. And I said to myself, this guy is not an upset person. Yeah. He's quite sane. And now I think that he could have, because in those days, if you examine the temperament of Texas in that time, carrying guns openly was quite allowed. And there was also something called the crime of passion law. And my theory is that Jack Ruby felt that he could shoot Lee Harvey Oswald, maybe do 2 years of time or so, 3 years, and come out a big hero and be something in his
That's what I think. I think he thought he was going to be somebody, and I think he thought he would wind up as a national hero. Question.
Did any of you have the opportunity to have any dealings or exchanges with Edward Clark? You know who I'm talking about. He's prominently named in this new book, Blood, Money, and Power, How LBJ Killed JFK.
He was all over the History Channel last night, but I never had anything to do with him.
Well, that book is...
No, I think it's
That's
just
really sleaze.
This is the father of our current
Well, I don't
press
care if
secretary.
it's George Washington. The book is totally discredited. There's nothing in that book that's true. Any other question?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you, there is theory that there is conspiracy of that time was U.S. involved with Kennedy was president with Cuba. I think that's one of them. The other conspiracy theory probably with Vice President Johnson was interesting to become president. Do you believe there is any conspiracy politically?
Why don't you ask each of us if we just yes or no? Do you believe there was a conspiracy or not?
I have seen no evidence that has convinced me that there was. I'm keeping an open mind about it. Among other things, people, aides to Lyndon Johnson, say that Lyndon Johnson always wondered if there was some connection with Castro, but he had no evidence of that. It was one of the things that people wondered about, but I do not believe that there. I've seen no evidence to that effect that convinces me. Sid?
That's what the Warren Commission said. The Warren Commission did not say there was no conspiracy. The Warren Commission said there was no evidence of a conspiracy, and nothing solid has come out in the 40 years since.
In 1973, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, taking the Kennedy assassination as a first project, concluded, among other things, that there were, because of sound tests that they had, two shooters, not one. Secondly, that it was the result, probably, of a conspiracy. But they did not say what the conspiracy was, who were the conspirators, and what they offered no details. So that's the closest that we've come to any suggestion at all that this was a conspiracy. And they did mention, if I have just a few more seconds, they did eliminate the Soviet Union as a conspirator, and I believe the Cuban government. Now, the Soviet government, the Cuban government, but they also said that anti-Castro Cubans may have been involved on an individual basis, but not as a group. So that's as close as they come to that.
Bob?
Yes, I have followed this story for 40 years. I read a lot of books with more or less an open mind, but I have felt from the beginning that Oswald acted alone. I would mention people can't understand what Oswald's motives were. If you really want to get inside Oswald's mind, read Priscilla Johnson Macmillan's book, Marina and Lee. She is a fascinating figure who was the only person who knew both Kennedy and Oswald, had worked for Kennedy and interviewed Oswald in Russia after his defection. She did an excellent book. She has a truer understanding of Oswald, the embittered hater who was hated everybody and thought the government was out to get him. And I think you'll get the sense of Oswald's motive if you read that book.
I think the best argument that there was not a conspiracy is that if there were, I think somebody by now would have told it.
Yeah.
That would be the thing over here.
Well, if that's the case, wouldn't we know who Deep Throat is? But moving right along, I think it's great that you did this book.
There's only 3 people know who Deep Throat is.
Well, why hasn't he come forward the third? Would you talk a little bit about the role of television at this time? I mean, it was really central in terms of a real turning point. We really all watched television in a way we never had before. And also, I wonder if you talk about how well you thought the press covered the event.
How about it?
Well, I think it was a defining moment for television. It really brought television news into its adulthood. For 4 days, the television networks did nothing but cover the assassination and the aftermath and the funeral. 175 million Americans tuned in over that 4-day period. The network cameramen were told not to take any close-ups of the Kennedy family in St. Matthew's Cathedral. There was a great deal of reverence in the way the story was covered. I think that the fact that I was not the only person who heard Father Oscar Huber say Kennedy was dead, who didn't use it on the air until we could get an official confirmation. I don't think that would happen today.
But don't you think, Sid, that this was a turning point in the sense, up until that point, what validated events was seeing it written down in black and white. From that weekend forward, survey after survey has shown that from then on, it was television that validated events. It was television that most people turned to get their news. And I think that was
Can I make a comment
the
on
difference.
that?
Yes,
I think what television brought to the nation at that point, one of the reasons why it was a defining moment was that this was the first event that we as a nation ever watched on television as a whole. There were other events that we could point to. One, the Queen Elizabeth coronation for one. A lot of people, it was just a day or so, but this was the first time we've had a national crisis that was told to us by television. And I think that the presence of the anchor people, the fact that we were breathing some assurance into the public through facial contact, eye contact with the people who were telling us the news. I don't think the newspapers could deliver that. You couldn't talk to the editorial board if you were worried about the survival of the country. You had to listen to the soothing words sometimes of Cronkite.
Let's go back here. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a native of Texas and an alum of Texas Christian University.
Are you really? 10-0.
I wasn't alive during the time of the assassination and have lived in Dallas, and I'm wondering now from your perspective of history, is the same stigma still associated with Dallas when people think of that place and the assassination?
Well, I don't think so, but someone else would.
More than half the country wasn't born when Kennedy was assassinated, so that's a big factor in this thing. I don't think Dallas still has the same stigma as it did a few years after the assassination.
You know, let me just add one thing. For example, the 6th floor museum. After this happened, the Texas School Book Depository, where Oswald was, there were people in Dallas who wanted to bulldoze that building. They wanted to erase it from history. They didn't want to think about it. And wiser heads prevailed. The county finally bought the building. They now have county offices in that building. And up on the upper floors is this, what they call the 6th floor museum. This could have been something like a bizarre Ripley's Believe It or Not kind of place. It is not. It is a repository for information. It's become a place where scholars can go. And I think it has something to do with the changes that did come about in Dallas. Democracies need an accurate history, and the people there, I think, have done a wonderful job, and that museum, I think, is one example of it. Yes, Bob?
Let me comment for a moment on the job that I think the press and broadcasting have done over the years in covering the assassination. The instant job of covering this horrible tragedy and what it meant to the country, and tracing through the history of the Kennedy administration, a good job. I'd give them fairly high points on that. But the conspiracy theory coverage over the 40 years, the media generally, the Washington Post has done a number of stories building up, seizing on conspiracy theories and playing off them. My own parent, ABC, was criticized by Jerry Ford several years ago. Ford is the only surviving member of the Warren Commission, who was criticized by Ford for its role in some television programming that build up conspiracy theories. So I would put a fair share of the blame. There have been a lot of mysterious elements in the assassination, and it's been logical for the American public to be suspicious, but the press generally has disappointed me by too often choosing the best story as it approached the assassination, and the best story has always been some probably cockeyed conspiracy theory.
All right. Well, folks, I'm very sorry. The powers that be are signaling me that it is time to bring this to a conclusion. I think the one thing we can all agree upon is this was a day that changed America. It was a turning point in our history. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen.